This is a Viva PR podcast.
There's never a perfect time to start up a business. Now, obviously, we use the popular phrase, "Oh, don't be a dick." I would argue, be a dick. If I think the client should be paying more, guess what I do? I go to a client and say, "Excuse me, client, we're working bloody hard on your business, getting brilliant results. Please, can we have more fees?" So I'd always use the word talkability, which was the buzz that takes over and does your best marketing for you and kickstart that word of mouth, that buzz. It was very important to never give up.
Welcome to PR in the Real World with me, Tony Garner, and stay tuned for this one. It's an absolute cracker because today we've got none other than Graham Goodkind, industry legend who co-founded the agency Frank. If you've not heard of Frank, where have you been? So Graham got in touch with us. Why? Because his agency is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year, and we thought it'd be really good to kind of unpick the 25 lessons that Graham and his team have unearthed over that time. And I was dying to ask him about the time he convinced snooker ledge Jimmy White to turn his name to Jimmy Brown. Stay tuned, strap yourselves in. This is an absolute belter. Let's go.
Graham, fantastic of you to join us. I'm really looking forward to this chat. For listeners, we had a bit of a pre-chat so that we could put some guardrails in place and make sure Graham doesn't square too much. Anyway, thanks for joining us, Graham.
You expect me to swear a lot then, do you? Okay. No, pleasure to be here. Really looking forward to having our chat today.
So Frank is 25 years this year. That's amazing. Well done. Looking back, does it feel 25 years?
You know, it's funny when you ask the question, it's like, if I think about it, it seems to have gone, all happened in, super, super fast. But, then if I look back on some of the work we did and some of the, kind of highlights and lowlights, they seem like bloody years ago. So, it sort of feels both fast and slow. I think importantly, 25 years is, I don't know whether you have in dog years or how many years that is in agency life, but that's probably 100 years in agency life because there's not many of us that manage to stick around for that long. And certainly not many founders who are in a business that I know of that are still here knocking around, just trying to stay in touch and stay relevant 25 years later. So, from a personal point of view, it's been an absolutely brilliant journey, and from a professional point of view and business point of view, it's been amazing. The company's had a few different iterations over the years. It's changed ownership a few times. It's had various numbers of offices here and in other on other continents. It kind of, if you say all those things, you think, wow, 25 years, where did all that go? But, we're here today. Hopefully we're just as relevant as we ever were. We've got, a lot of history, and that gives us hopefully credibility. We're still, I think, at the top of our game in terms of, operating in the PR market. We're still competing with all the kind of younger agencies that have started up in the last few years. We're up against them. We're up against a few older ones, so we can mix it with the best of them, and long may that continue.
Excellent. Well, you've been really good at this because you've pulled together 25 lessons from 25 years at Frank, and we might not get through them all in this session, but it would be really good from my point of view, and I'm sure from the listener's point of view, to dive into some of your kind of favourites. So instead of kind of rattling through it as a kind of long list, shall we look at kind of different clusters and themes and pick out some of those thoughts?
I think that's a great way to do it. Yeah.
Right. Well, cool. Let's talk about starting off then. What were your kind of lessons from starting out, Frank, back in the year 2000?
Well, I think the main learning, if I rewind to the year 2000, is it was a hell of a year, in terms of stuff happening in my life. In March 2000, March the 10th to be precise, my twins, Dexter and Summer, were born. They're our first and only two kids, and twins as well. what is a pretty life-changing experience for any people out there that have had twins. I'd highly recommend it, but I'd also write off the first few years of their lives to be hands-on, particularly as a dad. I'm brilliant as a dad for me, because actually, if you've got twins, you have to be involved. I mean, my wife's only got one pair of hands. And, I think one of the advantages of having twins, there is an advantage. It's certainly not two for the price of one. It's two for the price of two with twins, let me tell you. But the advantage is, as a dad, you can get really, really involved. So I had that in March. We had to move home, because in February we had to get out, because I had a lovely flat, but it was on the 6th floor of a beautiful block. Which was my dream bachelor pad, I guess, that my wife had moved into. But having twins, it weren't a good idea, particularly when the lift didn't work. It wasn't going to be much fun getting them up and down 6 flights of stairs.
No.
So we had to move out in February. So we rented somewhere just before they were born. I'd also just selling my stake in another company in between setting up Frank and sort of my last role in PR. Before that, I'd set up a .com, as was the thing to do, and I'd built and grown a .com and managed to exit that, and had all my sort of legal stuff around selling my stake in May of that year. And then in November, we had to move again, because we'd done sort of 6 months in our new place and sort of knew with the twins what we needed and what we didn't need. So I bought somewhere. So I moved twice, sold a business. And then in September 2000, I thought it was a good idea to set up a PR agency, just right in the middle of everything in a year that was pretty bloody hectic. I threw that into the mix. And I guess that sort of sums up the first lesson, really, is there's never a perfect time to start up a business. There's never a good time to do it. And so many people in life, when I talk to them about, I'm thinking of doing this, I'm thinking of doing that, I'm thinking of setting my own agency, but, I've got a lot of things on this year, or I'm doing this, this is happening, that's happening, the other thing's happening. Yeah, I'll leave it till next year, maybe. I'll leave it till whenever. I'll leave it, always putting stuff off. And it's a bit of a cop-out, I think, in my opinion. It's a bit of a self-protective net that maybe some people put around them. There's never a perfect time to do it. You just got to do it, to quote another iconic brand. It's so easy to give in life, to give yourself reasons not to do something. And I had plenty, let me tell you, of reasons not that wasn't the right time to set up Frank. But it just felt like the right time. Things were happening. I had a brilliant, an ex-client of mine, actually, who was running a branding consultancy, a chap by the name of Phil Lay. He was one of my favourite ex-clients. I used to work with him at Sega and Virgin, where he was this kind of marketing director guru of the day. And he had a brilliant brand consultancy. He'd moved out of that. They were working with a lot of really exciting companies. And he kept on saying to me, he goes, Gigi, who can get me to do the PR for this? Who would you recommend to do the PR for the other, all these clients that it's got? And I got to think, well, I kind of fed up recommending people. I said to him, how about I set up a PR agency, you back it, invest in it a little bit, then we'll set up an agency. And that's where you can, sort of refer all these clients that are hungry for PR recommendations. And that's how really Frank was born. And that was all happening at that time. It was the .com era. So he had a lot of .com clients who had quite a lot of money. And, that was the nugget that made me do it at that point in time. If I'd have waited, then actually the .com bubble burst not long after that. And maybe it wouldn't have been the right time to do it. So do it. Don't put off stuff. There's never a perfect time to start your business up. You've got to go for it when you feel it's right.
Are you the kind of person who does kind of just seize the day and grab that opportunity? Would people listening to this who know you go, yeah, that's Graham all over? That's.
I think I'm definitely the sort of person that can be quite impulsive. That if I think it's a good idea, then and we can do it, let's just do it. I mean, I'm not, I do think things through, obviously, and you have to in business. And when you've got people's lives at stake and you run a company and you're responsible for them and all that sort of stuff, obviously it's a considered, you have to consider that. But I definitely, I love that. And I love that about being an independent business and an independent agency. And as we are again now, and we'll talk about that no doubt later, the different eras of Frank when we weren't and now when we are again. I definitely love that. If I had a good idea coming in on the train this morning and I sort of wanted to do something, then by 11 o'clock you can just do it. And I don't mean to say that you're reckless about doing something, but certainly being independent has that advantage rather than having to to wade through different layers of management or shareholders or investors or whatever to get things done.
So you've taken the plunge. It's September 2000 and Frank is in existence. But what are the kind of early lessons then from life as a fledgling agency, and how do you set your stall out there?
Well, I think setting your stall out is important, and you've hit the nail on the head. And I think that was my sort of like my another big lesson is, I would say, try to have a point of difference. You know, in agency land, you know, what does an agency do? It's you know, setting out to be the best at PR, or we're going to do, you know, award-winning PR campaigns and stuff. Everyone says that. Mm-hmm. It's kind of boring. There's no differentiator, and I think in a crowded market such as PR agencies were at that time and still are today, you need a USP. And at Frank, I had this word, which was talkability. Yeah. And, you know, it was originally maybe going to be the name for the agency, but it wasn't quite right as the name. It was much better as a modus operandi and as an ethos, I guess. And I'd always use the word, you know, always in PR. And I think a lot of other people had as well, which was, you know, this word talkability, which was the buzz that takes over and does your best marketing for you. And, you know, the kind of job of any PR, any great PR campaign was to kickstart that word of mouth, that buzz, that viral effect, as we call it now, the shareability, as we call it now. But, you know, I called it talkability. And I think it still is just as relevant today as it was always. Kind of know what it means. Doesn't mean you just have to talk about it around the water cooler down the pub after work or share it with friends. It's now, you know, something of interest you might post on your WhatsApp group, or something you might share on your Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, whatever it is like that. So that's what I kind of always use, the word talkability. And I thought, oh, well, you know, how about us having a USP? We'll kind of own it. And I thought, how do you go about owning it? Well, firstly, I bought all the domain names up, which was the starting one. And then I decided to register it as a trademark. So talkability has always been and a registered trademark of Frank PR since I set the business up. So we were the only agency that provided talkability. And I'm sure over the years, lots of other agencies have come along and said, oh, you know, but we do talkability as well, like that. Well, they do, but they don't, if you see what I mean. And the amount of clients I've had over the years that have come to me and said, Gigi, you know, we just went and saw this other agency. Guess what? They use the word talkability as well. Like that. I said, you know, but it's your word, isn't it? I said, absolutely, it's our word. You know, tell me who they are and I'll send them an invoice. And, you know, not quite I've ever done that. Maybe I should have done that. I made a few quid as well on that. But that was our ethos. That was our point of difference. It allowed us to stand out in a very crowded market. And you know what? It still does today. We also did silly things that brought talkability to life. And, you know, we kind of had, I mean, but one of the best things that we had for years, which really was a point of difference in terms of, you know, having an agency with a point of difference, is we had, I mean, a lot of agencies have dogs now. We've got a couple of dogs that we've got roaming around the office most days. But we actually had a greyhound dog. I was racing more or less every week at Walthamstow. I remember we went on it was one of the guys here, it was there, they were getting married, and we went on a work sort of like stag night, if you like, but everyone from the whole agency came to Walthamstow dog track, which wasn't a million miles away from Camden Town where we started life. And we had a brilliant night, sort of, you know, you have your scampi and chips and a pint, and it's like really good fun, and there's loads of races, and it's a shame that dog racing isn't such a thing anymore. It was a brilliant night out. I'm sure it still is, but it doesn't happen at so many places. And we came back the next day and someone said to me, this is a good example of what you said about, you know, am I someone that likes to do stuff, you know, quite impulsively and just do it. The next morning, someone came into the office and said, it was a brilliant night last night. Great, Gigi. Why doesn't Frank have its own dog? And I said, I don't know. Let's get a dog like that. And literally I didn't know a ton about greyhounds. I've been dog racing a few times because it was a good night out, but I didn't know a lot about it. So then I found out that you had to have a trainer that was kind of connected with the dog track. So we had Walthamstow was our nearest one. So it had to be there. So I looked at the list of trainers. There was one trainer called John Coleman. And I only chose him because there was a heart radio DJ at the time called John O'Coleman, who was a really nice Aussie guy who I actually knew and did stuff with. So I thought, okay, John Coleman will do. So I gave him a call. I said, you know, I want to buy a greyhound. I won't put on my Irish accent, but he was an Irish fella, and He goes, it just so happens we've got one coming in from Ireland tomorrow, which is where most greyhounds come from. And I thought, okay, well, maybe this is a bit too good to be true. I'm kind of getting taken for a bit of riding, but let's see it. But okay, who is it? So this dog was coming the next day, and he tells me about his pedigree, and his mum and dad were, and he had like 700 brothers and sisters as well. But that they were bred for that purpose. He was coming the next day. I said, well, that's great. I think his name was Ard Highway. That's a good memory if I think I'm correct, actually. And he said, so that's great, but we need to rename him. Do you like dogs have deed poles and stuff like that? And they said, yeah. So anyway, so I did a little thing at work. So we renamed him Flying Frank. And he was trained by John Coleman and raced, most weeks at Walthamstow, but we made him into a bit of a celebrity. So he had his own blog, and he became the first ever dog with a blog. And any work that we used to do with celebrities at the time, we used to get them to send him a message. Normally, just take a picture with a piece of A4 with sort of some punny headline, or headline. So I know we all like football. So I remember ones that spring to mind. We had Stevie Gerrard, dear Flying Frank, you'll never run alone. Being a Liverpool legend, you'll never walk alone. Phil Tufnell, the cricketer, Flying Frank, you're one tough dog. You get the drift of what we did. Our dream, I always remember Carr, the comedian, what's his first name?
Jimmy Carr.
Jimmy Carr. So we had him, and it was, Flying Frank, you have great charisma. You kind of get the drift of what we did. Our dream was to get Frank Lampard to do one, and we got to work Frank Lampard, and he did sent a message from one Flying Frank to another was his. So we kind of had all these things and built up a bit of a following as a blog that you'd follow. And then it eventually, as good ideas do, like we create Talkability, got picked up by the mainstream media. He was the first ever dog to be interviewed by The Sun Online, and it was front cover of The Sun Online. He had a whole page devoted to him in the Daily Star in their sports section, and I've still got it on my toilet at home. It goes, the headline is "The Mutt That's Got the Stars Going Nut," and it was all the pictures of all the celebrities sending things. But the first, let me tell you, in terms of, talking about having a point of difference, for about 3 or 4 years, the first 10 minutes of any meeting I had with a client, potential client, was, how's the dog doing? Tell me what's the latest with the dog. And as well, we used to go and see a race. I've still got, as well as surrounding me at Frank PR, 101 trophies for winning this award for this campaign, that award for that campaign. I've got all these sort of little trophies that we picked up at Walthamstow Dog Track for the Sargasso Sea Stakes, which was still my proudest sporting moment as his owner, going up to collect that in the middle of the Walthamstow Dog Track. So it was a real point of difference that, we had the Talkability, and then we brought it to life with things like Flying Frank that really added to that. And were bloody brilliant fun, and the whole agency could get involved with. So try and have a point of difference. That would be definitely my other learning.
I guess on that, you talked about, I know for a fact that you've got a photograph of one of your heroes, Dick Fosbury,
yes, on
your office wall. Can you tell people why that is, and what Dick Fosbury has to do with running a PR agency?
On the face of it, you kind of maybe struggle to make a connection, but it's something that I've always believed, and this is really, I think, important for an agency like Frank as well, was, obviously we use the popular phrase, "Oh, don't be a dick," when someone is, kind of just being a bit stupid or wrong or whatever. I would argue be a dick, and be a dick is actually a very positive thing. And when I say that, and that's the strapline I got behind my desk in big black letters on the wall, is that's a deference and in reference to Dick Fosbury. Now, Dick Fosbury, for people who don't know, was a pretty average athlete at the high jump. That was his sport. Where you run up to the bar and kind of go over it. And when he was starting off in the sort of mid-late 60s, he wasn't brilliant at it. He wasn't terrible at it. He represented his college. And if anyone sort of has a, look on Wikipedia or something else, you'll read about his history. He was no great athlete, and he was probably never going to make it as a great superstar in his sport. And he thought, I can carry on trying to do the same as I'm doing at the moment and improve maybe gradually, or I can look at kind of flipping things on its head, really, and doing it, in a very different way and taking a very contrary approach. So he started and pioneered and started practicing and then pioneered a new technique where it's instead of in that sport, everyone went over the bar and went over head first, as had been the way that everyone had done it forever. He went against the grain, and when he ran up, he sort of went over backwards and shoulder first, and it worked. And it worked bloody brilliantly. And the year where he pioneered that technique, he went to the Olympics and he smashed the Olympic world record and won his gold medal in the process. And today, still, the technique which became known as the Fosbury flop is the way that people have done it ever since. And kind of the world record has been broken continuously since then. So I think the principle was there to be a dick. And certainly when I started the business up, I wanted to go against the grain of the convention, if you like, of what other agencies had done. And it sort of, ties in nicely, which was what I said about having a point of difference. But, being a dick for me, for example, in the early days was every agency had timesheets. And that was the way you had to do PR. And to an extent still is, how do you manage your business if you don't do timesheets? How do you charge clients if you don't charge by time? I don't know. I took a completely contrary view to that. I always thought actually clients don't care about input so much. They all they care about is output. They're worried about the results. They don't necessarily care how long it takes you to come up with it. I think being a creative agency, as we always set our stall out to be, and that was very important from a creative point of view, as people know that kind of are in to do with idea generation, it's not a factor of time that you take. I mean, I can, come up with a great idea, maybe not even in work, in the bath, on the treadmill, walking to work from the station, whatever. Or I can come up with it in a sort of creative session, brainstorm, whatever, in the office. But it could be the first idea you come up with, and you sort of dive it after 10 minutes and you go, great, crack that. It does not mean it's worth 10 minutes of time to a client. So I kind of threw timesheets out and have actively spoken out about them, against them, if you like, over the years. I don't think they're very efficient. I don't think they tell you how well your agency is being run. I don't think they're accurate for a start, which defeats the object of every timesheet. Anyone I know that is involved with timesheets, I'm talking to my daughter actually yesterday, who works at an agency that do timesheets. She works in PR and is starting her career and hopefully going to be very successful in it. But she said, well, I do my timesheets, we were talking about it. And she goes, yeah, I do my timesheets on a Friday and sort of fill it. I said, well, how do you know what you've done throughout the week? Well, she goes, well, I don't. I kind of roughly approximate what I've done. And I said to her, well, so, do you sometimes like make up? She goes, well, I have to make up because I can't remember what I was doing on certain days. And then I kind of fill in the timesheets probably like a bit like I'm meant to fill it in, like this client, is quite big and pays a lot of money, so I should allocate more time to that, whatever. So they're not even accurate. And I've done tons of research on this whenever I've campaigned against timesheets that show that most people don't fill out timesheets accurately. They can't be asked to fill them out, at that moment in time. And when they do, it's retrospectively and it's bound to be full of errors. So I couldn't really see the point in using timesheets. I didn't want to charge clients based on time because I wanted to charge them more based on ideas, because that was more valuable. And I didn't think it was much fun. It's just a horrible way to work. I'm not someone that logs time. I want to kind of, come up with the results and do that for clients and not charge them time. And I've never had a conversation with a client. People often say to me, so Gigi, when you're spending a lot of time on a client's piece of work and you want to ask them for more money, what do? You haven't got a timesheet. What do you do, when you ask a client for more money? I said, well, there's two things. If I'm doing a shit job for that client and I'm spending a ton of time on it, a client ain't going to increase their fees because you're doing a shit job. So it's not a factor of time. And if I think the client should be paying more, guess what I do? I go to a client and say, excuse me, client, we're working bloody hard on your business, getting brilliant results. Please, can we have more fees? And it's either a yes or no. I never need a timesheet to have that conversation. But, you're doing a good job or not. That's how you engage in a conversation. There's no point in doing a crap job but spending tons of time. I don't think any client's interested in that. And then I also argue the case that, funnily enough, the best lawyers don't charge by time. They normally charge by percentage of the deal that they're involved in. So it's not only by that. So you don't have to charge by time. But anyway, being a dick, we didn't charge by time. It's set out stalled about being a creative agency, not one that obsessed with the time. all about creating buzz for your brand, not about the amount of work that we put in. And, it really helped us and still does today, to be honest, whenever we're up against agencies that do that. It also sums up our approach to creativity and coming up with ideas is how do you disrupt conventions? How do you take an alternative approach to addressing a problem or addressing a category? And, it is the starting point really for our creative process at the agency.
So this idea of talkability is kind of the external positioning. The ideas on banning timesheets is a kind of an internal management tool. How does that inform how you have conversations with your team about your approach and what's important from your perspective to land in front of clients? How do you manage things? And when I'm interested from a
time point of view?
Just in.
Look, I mean, you have a client that pays a certain fee.
Yeah.
So obviously the way you tend to allocate resource is linked to that. More it's linked to the scope of work that you've agreed. So, and obviously you've taken some approximation of time. But my view has always been it's all about the ideas, because if you can come up with a great idea, as we all know, that isn't a really bloody hard sell to media or, these days, to get kind of maybe influencers to pick it up or whatever, or, to get people to talk about it or write about it. If you can come up with just a brilliant idea that does the hard work for you, then actually you don't spend that much time implementing it. So the better your ideas, weirdly enough, conversely, the less time you take to implement. So I can remember, we did a couple of years ago, a brilliant campaign for Weetabix, client still today, whereby we came up with this weird food combination. So it was based on research, and we'd seen from, a lot of social media feedback and social listening that Weetabix wasn't just used as a breakfast cereal. People had, all different ways of eating it and using it to cook as well. And they had all different ways of enjoying it. I mean, most people enjoy it over milk, with milk over it. Sometimes a bit honey, whatever, a bit of sugar, sometimes whatever. There were conventional ways. But there were lots of alternative ways that you could maybe enjoy your Weetabix. So we came up with a few, and we partnered up with the brands, to do that as well. But one of them, the one that took off massively, was pairing up, two breakfast time favorites, if you like, Weetabix with Heinz baked beans. It was, we executed quite nicely because we did a few other link ups. So we paired it with Marmite, we paired Weetabix with some peanut butter, we paired it with innocent smoothies to pour smoothies on it instead of your milk. And then we built it with that, had a bit of brand banter going on, and then we finished it off with the last one that really hit home was beans. And we went, baked beans on Weetabix, are you mental like that? It's like, how can that be? Oh, maybe I'll try it, whatever. But you can see it had that talkability, and it went completely mad. I mean, it started taking off online with lots of interaction, lots of other brands piling on, and then and we were just sitting back and watching it. Obviously we were trying to rushing to comment as the on the social channels for Weetabix. But we didn't really have to do much stoking it because it just sort of encapsulated the vibe of the day and the moment. But the next by that afternoon, the media were onto us saying, we want to do something with this, and we'd send them round some Weetabix and some baked beans. It cost us a lot, With the Weetabix here, we had to go out and buy a few cans of baked beans as well. And the next morning it was all over the TV channels or the breakfast TV presenters, all trying it, eating it. Oh, I like it. I don't like it. Piers Morgan was doing breakfast TV at the time and was raving about it. He quite liked it. Radio show DJs were trying it the next day. I mean, it was going everywhere. And then the next day, newspapers were writing about this new food craze that's taking over. And sent the internet into meltdown over it. The actual time-based input on the idea wasn't a lot. But what was brilliant was the value of the idea and the insight, and that weird food combinations was the insight. It ended up even, and this was unbelievable. I remember seeing, and I never really switched on the BBC Parliament channel. You probably haven't either. Not a lot of people listening to the show haven't. Oh, I hope they haven't anyway, though. Yeah. Kind of, it's not really the most compulsive of viewing. But if you put on the BBC Parliament channel, there was a debate that the subject of Weetabix and beans was potentially even more divisive in the UK than Brexit. I mean, it was unbelievable that this was going on in Parliament as a result of an idea we'd had a couple of days earlier. But my point is, it was brilliant fun, a brilliant idea, won tons of awards. Every client since has, come to saying, "Oh, I want another Weetabix and beans." It's a perfect example of the unbelievably organically viral.
If you just charge for the time that it took you to come up with that,
a couple of £100, that would have been worth, like that, if that, because it didn't, it was, that's the point. So, I don't think agencies, if you're maybe if you're doing some other form of PR other than creative consumer-led PR, fine. Maybe that more consultancy-based PR, then that's the way you've got to charge. But in the consumer PR market, which is, where we've always operated, time was it's just not a factor really. It's the ideas are the currency, not time.
You've got the setup back in 2020. You've taken the plunge. You've
2000, not 2020.
2000. Yeah. You planted your flag in the sand. This is how you're going to be, and this is how you're going to be different. When did people first start taking notice of some of the work that you were doing?
I think early doors. I mean, we started cracking campaigns out, 2002, 2003. I remember at the time, I think 2003 and 4, we had the overall campaign of the year at the PR Week Awards for some work we did for Nickelodeon. An unbelievable moment. I can remember sitting there, newish agency, 2-3 years old. There we were up on stage, kind of being presented with the biggest accolade in the industry for our work. That was for, as I said, was work for Nickelodeon, and we had another campaign which is very famous for HP Sauce, whereby we did the most unusual. This really does sum up beer dip. We did the most unusual sponsorship deal in the history of sport, perhaps, but certainly in the history of snooker. So we were back to our the context. So we had to relaunch HP Sauce. And there wasn't really anything different about HP Sauce, and the product and the flavour and the combination of ingredients hasn't ever changed. Yeah. So where's the news? There's no new news, but they wanted a big buzz and big burst of attention and awareness before they were kicking off a TV ad campaign, and that's where they came to us. So I remember pitching an idea to them, which they bought unbelievably, which was all about. We looked at what was happening at that moment in time. So just before the ad campaign was coming on, there was snooker was kind of big, and there was the British Masters, which was the major tournament, had 200 hours of coverage on TV. We looked at the sport of snooker. It shared a lot of common values with HP Sauce. It was a British institution sport invented by British Army officers in India, as I recall, and sort of dated back to similar roots as HP Sauce did. HP, by the way, called because it was the official source of the Houses of Parliament. Hence HP. So that's the reason why. And also, it's got tamarind in it, which kind of comes from India. So there was a lot of sort of similarities. Maybe I'm diving a bit too deep with snooker, but there was a lot of things there. But also, snooker had in it a ball which was obviously of the same colour of our sauce as a brown ball. So I can remember coming up with the idea, and I said, well, why don't we sponsor the brown ball in snooker? And you went, what? How do you? No one's ever sponsored a ball before. I said, I know, doesn't really matter. No one's done it before, and it makes it even better. But we only sponsor one ball. And I remember having a surreal conversation with World Snooker, who were the official governing body of the sport, saying, hey, we want to sponsor a ball in snooker, and they couldn't believe it either. Anyway, we did a deal to become the official sponsors of the brown ball in snooker, because that's the only one we were interested in, for the British Masters. And to commemorate the deal, the landmark deal, we managed to get Jimmy White, the sort of proper good old sort of poster child or poster boy of British snooker, and kind of good fit with the brand HP Sauce as well. We managed to get him to change his name by deed poll, so it was official for the tournament, to not doggy deed poll this time, but human deed poll, to Jimmy Brown, or he actually preferred James Brown, and he actually took part in the tournament as Jimmy Brown, which was quite clever because it wasn't Jimmy HP, it was kind of Jimmy Brown. Yeah. The BBC were covering it. They were in a complete tiz over what to do. Was the sponsorship, were they, because they couldn't mention the brand, which made it even better. So they tried to ban him to start, not to compete, which they couldn't. They tried to then pick holes in, it was just a PR stunt. Well, it wasn't. And we'd done the official paperwork and had officially changed his name, which we'd submitted to, the tournament organisers. We'd submitted to all the people covering, all the producers at the BBC, who were covering the sport, informing him that was his name. So we did it all efficiently. They couldn't. So reluctantly, they had to call him that eventually. But that played out in the newspapers.
So the BBC row, it gives you even more kind of...
Oh, it was brilliant. Trying to ban something, when they wanted to ban it, it was like, they fell right
happy days.
Exactly. And it kind of went everywhere, and it dragged. And Jimmy White, or Jimmy Brown as he was then, did quite well. I remember going actually to the tournament. I remember going there. It's got a lot of fans, Jimmy White. It's quite a big cult.
Yeah.
And they produced, like, his fan clubs had produced special merch, and they had Jimmy Brown T-shirts that you could buy. The Jimmy Brown the Whirlwind. It was still the Whirlwind, but he was and you could buy special merch commemorating. So everyone got into the idea. He actually appeared in a tournament on Sky as well, just a week before the Masters took place and just after we announced it. And they started playing as his walk-on music as he came out, because Sky was a bit more rock and roll. Mm-hmm. They started playing some James Brown music for him as he came out, into the arena. It went everywhere, and it mutated from just sports coverage into a general story because of the kind of BBC's reaction. He did quite well. So the coverage, I think he got to the quarters that year. And so the coverage sort of went on and on and ran on and ran on. The important thing was that, HP Source saw after that, I think it was something like a 15% uplift in sales, which never happened for that brand because nothing really happened. There was nothing new. There was nothing new or different for it to happen. But it was a massive surge in awareness, which did translate into a big uplift in sales. Won all sorts of awards, for the agency, which was lovely. And actually the clients that worked on that campaign became sort of Frank clients for life, and Thomas de Labriere is a lovely fellow, still a good friend of mine. He went on to work at Innocence Movies, became a client of Frank. He went and worked at PepsiCo, became a client of Frank. Went to work for Mars, became a client of Frank. So, wherever he went in his marketing career after that, which was brilliant because he had a campaign that opened the door for him to get a lot of jobs. But he was he brought us in with him when he pitched new brands. So, that really set us apart. And that's kind of one of the values of Frank, is be a dick. And it applies to really how you approach creativity and just try and, disrupt conventions, think not necessarily in the opposite way, but think in a way that it isn't the way that everyone else has always done it.
When people are zigging, you zagging. Yes. So let's move on to the next one. Never take no for an answer. Explain that one for me.
Well, there is kind of two sides for this. Definitely, it's a thing in life, I think, and it's certainly a thing when you're starting up the agency. It was very important to never give up, really, and to never take no for an answer. I remember one of our first clients, our big breakthrough client back in the day, was Amstrad. So Alan Sugar's company, as he was then, now Lord Sugar. But originally, he was, when we started working with him, he was before he became a sir and before he became a lord. He was a regular member of the public, just like us. And via actually this brand consultancy that I talked about that were integral in terms of getting us started up, and referring clients. They had Amstrad as a client, and they put us in touch with Amstrad. And I remember going to meet them, and they had a device at the time called an emailer, which was typical Amstrad product, which was a phone, a sort of little keypad to do emails, I think an answer phone, and a way to access the internet all in one little device for not a lot of money, because they kind of made it all very efficiently. And it was a bit of it didn't bomb as a product, but it didn't do amazingly well. But technology moves at such a pace, it was out of date. But I remember we pitched for that, and we thought we were spot on for it. And I remember getting a call from a lovely fella, still in touch with him today, a guy called Alan Hopkins, who was the marketing director at Amstrad. And we'd seen him, and he phones up a few days later. Bad news, I'm afraid. I'm not going to go with you guys. We've got another agency. They work for us on other Amstrad stuff, and just think it's easier that when they're doing a sell-in for, whatever, I think they work for Dulux paints, when they're, as well, not an Amstrad product, but, when they're doing a sell-in for Dulux, they said to us that they can selling the emailer as well. And I'm thinking, it's just not right, and you'd be such a brilliant client. We've got the brilliant ideas for you. And I wouldn't take no for an answer. And I remember I had, via a personal connection, I had an in with Alan Sugar's son, Simon. Family, my cousin actually was a family friend of his sister. Well, there was a connection there. And I got in touch with Simon. So I think you made a big mistake. I know you've, kind of told us we haven't got the business, but can I come in and see you with Alan Hopkins, who's the marketing director? Look, we're so right for you. I really believe it. Anyway, I did. Went back in there, saw Simon this time, and still this Alan Hopkins, and managed to persuade them that we, kind of were the right guys for their business. And, we got hired, won the business, and Amstrad was a client for 23, 24 years. And Lord Sugar was a client for that period of time as well. Over all their different businesses and different things that they launched over the years. And Simon's a good mate today. I spoke to him a couple of days ago, actually. So, relationships come about out of it, as well as clients. And it was a big client for us to win as Amstrad. It was the first big name, household name, if you like, or household brand on our client list. And I just wouldn't take no for an answer. And we forget that too easily. Now, we get knocked back for something and you say, okay, I'll move on like that. No, never try. And I sometimes have to remind myself, never lose that tenaciousness that you had when you were setting something up. And there was another one. It applies to not just in startup phase, it applies for your work as well. And I keep on trying to remind people here about it as well. We had a campaign also, it might be my favourite campaign that we've ever done, but it's kind of going back a bit as well. So we got a brief from The New Scientist, which is, a fantastic scientific magazine publishing institution, I guess. And we got a brief from them that went out to different agencies, and not just PR agencies, sort of creative type agencies. They were doing a relaunch, and a relaunch for them meant they were doing a slightly different typeface, and they had a few new editorial columns and a couple of guest writers who I'd never heard of. And that was their relaunch, and they wanted an idea to help drive subscriptions. At the time they were doing this relaunch. As I said, it was more a reworking as opposed to a relaunch, I think you call it, but they were calling it a relaunch. So, and it came from the publisher. So we got this brief via, a connection. And I remember looking at it. Now, looking at the brief, and I'm absolutely crap at science. I got 0 scientific qualifications at school. I was useless at science and never really got it. So I thought, kind of, it's not a bad way to be a dick about it for a start, is that, I kind of know nothing about science, which is sometimes quite a good way to approach a brief. But I had a look at The New Scientist. It was actually quite an interesting magazine, if you've kind of ever read it before. And I sort of said it's everything about, sort of between life and death and everything in between was how I summed it up. And I sort of got a bit interested in the death bit of the spectrum. And I came on this idea that I'd been knocking about for a bit before in my head, but I managed to bring it to life for The New Scientist. And I pitched them with an idea which was to mark the relaunch. They were going to run the weirdest competition ever run by a magazine. And that competition would be the chance to win the chance to live forever, which was loosely based on science and some fringe science, where the winner of that competition, upon his or her death, would get taken to the Cryonics Institute in Michigan, frozen in a vat of liquid nitrogen, stored at minus 400 degrees, and then at such time in the future as medical science advanced enough, be defrosted, thawed out, presumably cured of what killed them off in the first place, and then have a second crack at life. And so that was what I pitched to the publisher. It would be the weirdest competition ever. It's sort of something would everyone talk about. Had tons of talkability, because, on a couple of levels, it's, well, that's never going to work, is it? Well, maybe it could. It's fringe science. Also, the other level, which kind of, I suppose, is more relevant, is would you want to do it? Would you want to come back to life in, let's say 500 years time without your family, friends, loved ones, or whatever, or, with perhaps, I don't know, Bolton Wanderers languishing in as a non-league team somewhere.
We'll be Champions League by then, surely.
You know what I mean? You know, so it's all these arguments. So I met publisher loved it. You know, they wanted to run it as a token collect across 5 different issues, which would really boost the circulation. Perfect reasons to get talking about science again in a kind of not too scientific way. Anyway, so I thought, brilliant. She goes, I've just got to run it. You know, always the final say is with the editor in chief. I said, fair enough, like that. She came back to me a few days later. No, editor won't have it. I said, what? But you love it. She goes, I know, I love it. The publishing team loves it. The marketing team loves it. The editor won't have it, like that. And I, again, never take no for an answer. I said, no, I'm not having that. It's the most bloody brilliant idea. You've got to do it. It's going to be everywhere. Going to achieve all your objectives. Can I come in and see the editor to have a chat with him, like that? And so she said, fine. So next day, I think it was, I was sitting in wait to see the editor, and I was having a flick through. They had the first edition of the New Scientist there, like in the 1950s or whatever. First edition of the New Scientist, front page headline, first edition of the New Scientist, colour TV. It will never happen, like that. That was, kind of, the first edition. I thought, oh. So anyway, so I go and see the editor. And he says to me, he goes, nice idea. I sort of get it. Very fringe science. But you know what? Scientifically, it's an impossibility. It'll never happen. I thought, that's what you said about colour TV. What? I said, I'm just reading your first issue of your magazine. And you said colour TV could never happen. How do you know? We don't know what's going to happen in the future. He goes, okay, well, that's as maybe, but once you're dead, you can't freeze something. And I go, because in September 2000, so I started the business in September 2000, March 2000, I had my twins. Well, they were via fertility treatment. And then, we had our embryos as common fertility treatment and other forms of, fertility issues these days. My wife had her embryos frozen, fertilized embryos frozen, that are frozen in super cold temperatures, and then defrosted at such time, you might want to have some more children. It happens time and time again, works perfectly well. And so I started talking about that with them. Well, you can be frozen and come back to life, can't you? Or, but they're not alive yet. So I started getting into this scientific conversation with a very scientific editor of the New Scientist, having 0 science qualifications. And I managed to persuade him that we should do it. And it was a good idea. Definitely never taking no for an answer. So we had to have a little concession, which actually worked out in our favour, which is you could win a chance to live for now or live forever. That was the option upon prize winner. So prize winner didn't have to necessarily choose eternal life, could also have opted for a holiday in Hawaii to have straight away. So that was the kind of, the option, which actually I was really hoping that the winner would choose, because actually fulfilling the prize of eternal life would have been tricky, because, thinking as a PR person and thinking it through, well, this person ain't necessarily going to die for a number of years. We're not necessarily going to be around as their agency when he or she dies to fulfill that prize. New Scientist publishing team are probably going to move on. How do you actually fulfill it? Anyway, it didn't matter, because the winner chose the holiday in Hawaii. But I didn't stop the whole publicity bandwagon rolling on. It went absolutely everywhere, talked about absolutely everywhere. I remember I actually found someone who had signed up to be cryogenically frozen. She lived in England, and she was, our spokesperson to talk about it. And her view, quite refreshingly and quite interestingly, was, she goes, look, is it going to work? She goes, I don't know. But, if there's only a 0.001% chance of it working, that's kind of more chance than the alternative. So, which was quite a pragmatic and realistic view. So she was our spokesperson, which then kind of, used as collateral to get on all sorts of radio and TV and have this debate talked about everywhere. And it became one of our most successful campaigns. Obviously won tons of business on the back of it, because everyone, comes and says, oh, I want another live forever type idea. And that all came out of, I guess, being a dick, but importantly, never taking no for an answer, particularly from the editor of the New Scientist.
I'm chuckling, because it's amazing, isn't it? This career PR world that we're both engaged in. Some of the kind of weird little avenues that you end up going down. You become a little expert in Cryogenic.
Stuff, I know, stuff you never expected to ever have any consideration of in your life. You suddenly know more than anyone else in the room about. I know, it's sort of funny. But I say never take no for an answer, but also conversely, I say never take yes for an answer.
Yeah.
And by that I mean sometimes, and I mean this more in sort of pitch settings, and lots of other agencies listening to this will be familiar with it. If you do a pitch and someone's like, positive all the way through, nodding, you get to the end of a 70-page deck, 45 minutes pitch, beautifully presented. They haven't asked any questions. You get to the end of the pitch and you go, any questions? And they go to you, no, perfect. Very thorough. You've covered everything off in all the detail that we wanted. Blah blah blah. And they just say, yeah, it's great, the whole time. That's a really terrible response, in my opinion. If a client hasn't engaged, if there isn't some objection somewhere along the way, some form of friction in that process, and someone just goes, yeah, yes, along the whole way, and you get to the end and they said yes as well. There's, I think it's a really bad sign. And actually, I'm trying to prompt them to ask more questions in that, and actually try and get them. Well, what do you think of this idea? What do you think of that? Did you like that? I want to get them to come up with something that I can have a discussion about, because I think if they've gone yeah all the way along, they're not the slightest bit interested. Their mind's made up already beforehand, or they hate you from the off, or whatever. There's some underlying factor which you don't know about that's maybe changed how the pitch process is being done, or whatever. But never take yes for an answer, and always try and get out of them why they've said yes the whole time, and there must be something that they want to discuss.
Well, I hope you'll take yes for an answer now, because we've done an hour now, and I'm really hoping that you can come back for another session, because I think we've still got several lessons to go through. We've not talked about people, we've not talked about deals, we've not talked about personal life and well-being or legacy.
I do wang on a bit sometimes, don't I, unfortunately.
So, as the man who won't take no for an answer, will you come back for our next episode, and we can do some more lessons from life in Frank?
Well, if you'll take yes for an answer, then I will, yes.
That's perfect.
Thanks for listening to PR in the Real World. If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you could subscribe to the podcast and leave us a quick review. Your support really helps spread the word and reach more marketing and PR professionals just like you. And don't forget to share this podcast with your colleagues or anyone who'd benefit from the insights we share. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for more tips, strategies and real world stories from the PR frontlines.